I figured we'd end this weekend on going back into Stephen King territory. In this case, talking about family pets that are morphed into something potentially terrifying and deadly. So, not really much else to say in regards to why these two would be put together. And I also revisited them recently. I read Cujo again just last year, and then over this summer, I listened to Michael C. Hall's reading of the audiobook of Pet Sematary. So there's kind of the whole kind of scenarios are still fresh in my mind. So we'll go into all that also, like the movies and the books. I'll probably come into it a lot too, given how, and we'll go into whether they work as adaptations as well. So we're gonna actually start with Pet Sematary, the book that King prefaced by saying this was the book that he, like, of all the things that he's written and all the territory he's gone into, it was apparently Pet Sematary when he kind of put the book down and said, maybe I've possibly gone too far. Like, maybe this is too much. So that in itself is a very intriguing introduction, like I said, given to the places he's been already. And then, of course, going into the script for the movie being his own adaptation. And it's like, I can't remember if he's ever confirmed this, but it kind of has that feel of, with him having that strong a feeling towards this story, it's like if anybody was going to adapt this into a script, better him than anybody else. So, and really, it is a pretty faithful adaptation, as you would guess, based on that. But at the same time, I do think if there's mainly problems in the movie, it probably comes from the direction, with the director being Mary Lambert, who is extremely talented and did, like, I think she's most famous for doing a lot of Madonna's most famous music videos, which seems like an odd fit for this material, but there are definitely moments where she can grasp the atmosphere needed for this kind of story. In that sort of dark and ominous way we get, like, the opening credit sequence, where we see, like, there's kind of the music in the background, and then we're going over all the different graves, and you can hear the children, like, saying goodbye to their pets on the audio, which is, like, this really nice, chilling introduction. And then going into everything else, it is worth noting this Blu-ray that they just put out for the 30th anniversary is, like, fucking amazing. Like, the way it looks and sounds now, it looks like, I know this is kind of a cliche to say about like a Blu-ray restoration, but I mean, it looks just as much made this day and age as the remake back in April does. It's, like, really incredible how clear it looks now. So, like, if you're a fan of the movie and you haven't sought this out, it's worth it. So now, on top of that, we go into the story with starting with the unseen death of Church, the daughter's Ellie's cat, which apparently was an event that happened in King's real life that basically propelled this story into existence. Where he and his daughter in real life, where she had lost her cat, kind of had the same dialogue that Lewis and Ellie do about the whole God can get his own cat and stuff like that, and she just really threw this fit in a way that almost kind of terrified King when he saw it, and thus this whole story was born. And you can sense that also, where it's like, at the beginning when he's trying to hide from Ellie the fact that Church has been found dead, when he's on the phone with her, and she's saying, like, you know, she loves him over and over again, and it's like this really heartwarming sound of your little daughter saying that she loves you, in this particular moment, in this context, is now nothing more than a twisting knife every time he hears it, because he's hiding such a gruesome secret. And this cat is found by their new friendly neighbor, Judd, who is pretty much forever personified in this performance by Fred Gwynne, where it's like, it's so much... Judd is so synonymous with Gwen's performance now that if you listen to the audiobook, whenever Michael C. Hall is reading Judd speaking, he's doing a perfect impression of Fred Gwynne, and it's amazing. And Gwen is also, like, this movie has like kind of a, I guess, a middling reputation, because there's a lot of people that praise it as one of the ultimate King adaptations and like a quintessential horror movie. And then there's others that do kind of see it as not only kind of a lost opportunity and not only kind of poorly made, but just kind of an overall, just kind of honestly kind of blends in with the other just throwaway horror movies of the time of the late 80s period, which there were a shitload of. We just talked about with the stuff surrounding Return of the Living Dead and back in 85, with this being 4 years after that. And I can't quite look at it that way because of just the subject matter alone, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the point I was getting at was that regardless of whether people love this movie or whether they hate it or whether they just fall in the middle, there seems to be one consensus opinion, and that is Gwen often being credited for being like the real strength of this movie. And I can easily see that. And his the scenes where he's just telling stories. What I like about the scenes of Judd telling us exactly what's going on here is that these scenes are really kind of win-win, because you could have just had Judd telling the stories to Lewis without us seeing anything, and Gwen's performance would have brought that vividly enough to life, that just seeing him speak the words would have been enough to get the terror of those stories across. But to the movie's credit, I mean, usually there's such a fine line in horror between the show don't tell thing, because there's a lot of cases in horror where just telling and not showing can be just as effective, if not more so. But they do a really good job of showing these past scenes. When we get shots like when Judd's dog comes back and we see him like coming through the sheet first before we see his face, before we get those Cujo vibes. Well, Cujo, who is obviously referenced in both the book and the remake, having kind of happened in the same universe, these two stories. But this one, I believe, omitted that entirely. But you can still kind of get the sense of that from that. And then there's also the whole Timmy Baterman story, which has always been really kind of freaky to me. That's something where I kind of think maybe it would have been a bit more effective if we were just told it rather than seeing it. Sort of like how that's sometimes it's more effective to read a horror story than it is to see it adapted, because your imagination can do even crazier things than actors and a camera and all that can do. But still, there is something here, and I've always wondered about the Tammy Baterman story in itself, because, like, as far as King's inspiration and when exactly he started writing this, because the Tammy Baterman story reminds me a lot of a movie from 1974 by Bob Clark. It's called Dead of Night, but you can also find it under the name Death Dream, and it kind of fits that same that movie is like an intentional sort of take on the monkey's paw, the whole "be careful what you wish for" thing, which is also kind of the ultimate theme of Pet Sematary as well, where this couple, their child goes off to war and he's killed, but when he comes back, he's just he's like unexplainably alive, only he's not there and he's causing terror. And it's like, I've always kind of wondered if King found inspiration in that movie when he came up with the whole Timmy Baterman storyline. But either way, it's still incredibly effective. So as far as talking about stuff that might be hard to adapt, that makes the story of Pet Sematary so strong, is when we get scenes like Pascal luring Lewis out into the woods for the first time. And it is like this really sort of eerie, atmospheric scene when he's like guiding him through the fog, and we keep seeing him like kind of in the distance as this sort of unreachable thing that Lewis just has to keep going out more and farther away from home, and more into potential danger or whatever the hell lurks in here. But there is something that it doesn't quite come through as much with the way King describes like dreams, and sort of being in that middle ground where you're not sure exactly where you are between reality and a dream, and it's like that. So to translate that to film would have been extremely difficult with the perfect way that King describes it. But I do think this scene is sort of, eerie enough and played up enough that it works for the most part. So especially given like this the kind of movie that we're dealing with here, because like even the huge fans of the movie can probably see like a lot of the campiness factor in it, like the fact that one of the first thing we're terrorized by in the movie is this is when Church comes back, and he's this not particularly threatening puppet with glowing eyes. It's a very sort of 80s horror effect, and that could be a part of the appeal to some of the people that love this movie, but yeah, I do think it's kind of you really kind of have to find a balance there with how much real darkness and tragedy is in just the subject matter in general, and then sort of going the more campy route in some of these scenes. There is a bit, it's hard to kind of mesh together a little bit, but I do think that is made up for in some of the scenes that really are like truly horrific, like the Zelda scenes, obviously, that basically personify the whole thing in regards to the fear of death, particularly through Rachel's interaction with Zelda through her past. This is another case where they handle the past scenes well, much like when Judd is telling a story from the past or whatever. And the interesting thing I thought they did with Zelda was the fact that she's played by a dude. I think kind of gives her this bit more, like, it kind of helps the grotesque appearance a little bit more, and it's much more jarring and, like, unnerving when you see it, because there's something so unnatural about, like, the makeup and all that, and how it's almost, like, she actually seems, like, monstrous. Because it's kind of the reverse of when you watch those movies, like when you see Pazuzu in The Exorcist, or you hear the voice of the demon or whatever, and they always cast a woman. And it's like there was always kind of something a bit off. Also, casting a woman to play like the bum behind Winkies in Mulholland Drive, and it's like there's something about sort of switching the genders when you're casting a horror role on top of like the makeup and effects, that just can really add this different sort of feel, and that works perfectly with the portrayal of Zelda here. And eventually we know this is all leading to the death of Gage, which is our really big turning point in the story. One of the things that I never really cared for, like it's always kind of really bothered me in the movie actually, is sort of following the truck driver up to this scene. And maybe I'm alone in this, but there's just something I really liked about throughout the rest of the movie. It seems so bizarre that, I mean, obviously, Judd warns us that those trucks are always going by. But, I mean, not only are they always going by, like, to the point that it's weird how often they go by, but how they're always, like, speeding, too. And there's, like, just something so... It's almost like something supernatural about those trucks. And it's especially when they're, like, blasting through this really quiet, like, neighborhood, if you can even call it a neighborhood. And so it just kind of seems like this disruption from another world, almost. And in the most crucial scene that these trucks play a part in, we just see this goofy dude behind the wheel just singing to the radio when this happens. Kind of really takes away from that. And also kind of falls in line with King's history with supernatural cars in more than one story, for sure. And it's... So yeah, that's always kind of thrown me off. And it's like, even if you do, like, humanize the driver, I still think it kind of works in the book when they talk about how, like, there's, like, a whole aftermath of what happened to the driver after that, where, like, he got, like, suicidal and all that stuff, and it still kind of adds this really dark angle to it, which I think is really stripped away when we just see the driver being a normal dude behind the wheel before this happens. So, but, yeah. So, and of course, this leads to a very dramatic middle portion of the movie, where it seems to... Well, the idea would be to abandon horror and go into, like, full-on tragedy. But the thing about this is that when you read that in King's book, you get a sense of how this tragedy and the humanizing everything is going to make the horror all the more scary when it ultimately happens. The go-to example for something like this, as of the past couple of years, is Hereditary. Where it's like you take real tragedy and you make it as real as humanly possible in this supernatural story, and that's when you can really get, because stuff like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist kind of set this up also. But the way this movie portrays that, and this is where I was talking about where I think sometimes the direction might fail it a little bit, where you get a sense that we're supposed to like really be feeling the loss, and that's where the focus is, the loss in the family. But to me, anyway, it's always left a really bad taste in my mouth when we get stuff like as soon as it happens and we see the bloody shoe rolling down the street. We have this moment of Lewis screaming, and the audio of Lewis screaming is played over images from like their family albums. And it's like, to me, that feels less like focusing on the loss and the tragedy in the family, and more just wallowing in the morbid. And it's never, I mean, maybe that's what Lambert was going for, to give it a bit more of a kind of like maybe she wanted to do like one particular tone and make everything feel like just sort of but as opposed to jumping back and forth between tragedy and horror. I can kind of maybe see the reasoning behind that, but to me it's never really set well. And that goes into, you know, the whole knocking over the casket and he sees Gage's arm in there just before it closes again. That's in the book, obviously. Like I said, it still feels like a confrontation of death, or death being like right in your face and having to make that choice and confront it. But the way it's depicted in the movie is just never set with me. So yeah, maybe it does other people. I don't know, and maybe I don't know. Maybe this has something to do with. I don't. Unlike some people, I don't hate Dale Midkiff's performance as Lewis. But I do think it is definitely a role that requires a really strong actor, like a stronger actor. And maybe that would have helped these scenes a little bit more, and maybe brought a bit more of the gravity to them, without just seeming like a more surface level thing like it seems to be. So yeah, I will give him credit for one thing. The scene where Gage comes back and he like rolls off the bed and knocks his head off the corner of the bedside table and just keeps playing the scene. I don't know if that was supposed to happen or not. That was particularly well played, so he's got that going for him. But speaking of that, yes, let's transition into Gage's return, which is played very nicely, where we see. I don't know that we necessarily need the shot of his hand coming back out of the grave. Even though that's like kind of the ultimate, like that's one of the images you think of when you think of this movie, that whole rising out of the grave visual. But I really love like when we see like the door open and then just his shadow on the wall, and then just like his, you know, legs where we can see where he's been all dirty and buried and stuff like that. And it's the way they really build that up to where it takes a while for them to show him once we know he's back. Even though there's not much different going on, he's not near as fucked up as Rachel when she comes back. It's just like the scar, but even so, that build up is like really nicely done, leading all the way up to one of the more infamous scenes in the movie with the cutting of Judd's heel, which is like that was always the two things I heard whenever this movie got brought up. People always brought up the slicing of the heel and Zelda as the two most terrifying things in this movie. But there is also some really nice sort of nightmarish imagery here, like when Gage reappears to Rachel, I think it is, and he's at first. The first time I saw it, I didn't catch the other scene at the parents' house, but just this image alone of like pale, dead-looking Gage with the top hat and the cane is just, it just seemed like this really, like it was strictly just to make him look weird and terrifying. It wasn't until later that I put together the whole we see that painting in Rachel's parents' house of I believe it's supposed to be young Zelda, and this is what Gage is wearing in this moment is Zelda's clothes. So it's that whole thing of like bringing out the terror in Rachel through both Zelda and Gage as a way of just like taunting her in the absolute worst possible way, because that's what this thing does. It just is horribly, terribly taunting until it kills you. And there's also in that picture you can see a cat that may possibly resemble Church as well. So it was all, you can sense that it was all put together by this supernatural force, with Judd talking all the way up to the this force apparently killed Gage to set all this stuff off just because Judd introduced him to it. And we can go as far as to say they probably killed Church too, given that Church's death is unseen. So yeah, so that there's that whole vibe to it, and that kind of goes back to the whole truck driver thing, and like it all fits together. There's just some things here that feel like blemishes that could easily be taken out and make this more effective. Um, like take like take for instance, we were talking about how the not particularly threatening puppet that Church is. The kind of disrupting these scenes that are otherwise effective. So we've got all this great stuff with Gage coming back. And then we've got this moment where he like flies out of the attic, which looks fucking dumb. So every now and then that kind of takes it up and kind of takes it more into that campy place, which kind of sort of contradicts what's going on with the more, you know, frightening side to it or whatever. And the idea of the way they end it, which is a bit of an obvious criticism, but I mean still, I guess you could say they are making a horror movie, so liberties need to be taken. So the moment when it becomes perfectly clear that when Rachel comes back and she looks all hideous and zombie-like, she kills him with a knife, apparently. When, if I remember correctly, the book ends more on it, because the whole thing is the maybe if I bury her soon, like right after she dies, maybe it'll have a different impact. Maybe she'll just come back without all the, you know, freaky shit happening. And if I remember correctly, the book kind of ends like ambiguously, where it's like we know that she comes back, but he doesn't get a look at her, and we don't know if maybe that did work, or maybe she is just going to kill him the way she does in the movie. So I think I do prefer the ambiguity, but we'll talk about this with Cujo also, where it's like, I guess you have to fit the tone of the movie you're making, and sometimes you may have to abandon the tone of source material if you've set up a particular something, because otherwise you're going to have some tonal issues here that you can't quite get across in about an hour 40 that you can in a book that's thick. So yeah, and like I said, with him adapting it himself, it sort of feels like you would think whatever's in this script is what he found to be either what he found to be most important, or he was trying to make it more of a traditional horror movie. When his book goes into so many other themes, and that's the thing too about this story in particular that makes King so great, is that you know there's a horror story in here for sure, and it's trying to be a horror movie, but the subject matter is like very, very dark and very, very tragic and goes kind of beyond horror. And that's what I think, because you kind of hesitate to say like King is one of your favorite authors, because there's almost sort of that stigmatism where he's strictly known as like the horror guy, mainly from people who haven't read a significant portion of his work, because it's like there is so much more to King than horror, even in his horror stories. We talked about that extensively when we talked about it. But like, and it's what he finds in like this humanity that he's able to find horror in and bring it out in that way, and that's why his stories are so notoriously terrifying. But it feels like you hardly see him get the credit of being more than just it's strictly horror on a surface level, because it's like it's the places that he finds in subject matter like this that is just so deep into the whatever. Like I said, it's beyond horror, really. So it's like that is going to be lost when you have to make a movie that is sort of strictly horror and is made to be marketed as such. So yeah, but as far as an adaptation goes, it is still it's hard to say faithful because he did it himself, but as far as like visually, like from the director's standpoint and stuff like that, yeah, I would say there's more that works than doesn't, but every now and then you have those sort of campy elements, the face in the graveyard, whatever the fuck that is. It's so yeah, it's fine as an adaptation. It's a movie that kind of had to grow on me over time, but I consider myself more or less a fan now. I wasn't so much the first couple of times I saw it, but I've since more or less gotten there, and it's becoming easier to forgive the portions that I think are a bit more not up to par than some of the other good stuff in it. So going on to Cujo, Cujo is an interesting case of, first off, it's a concept that sounds like it probably shouldn't work. Two characters trapped in a car with a rabid dog outside. And it seems like there's so many ways you would think characters could get around this horror. And it's like the whole feeling trapped thing. But like once you see exactly how the pieces come together and everything's set up, like half of this story is just things setting into motion for this event to happen. Uh, and that's what I think kind of makes it really unique. It is also worth noting, though, that I'm not quite sure if this is entirely true, but the story I've always heard was that King was so deep in his alcoholism at the time that he does not even recall writing Cujo. Uh, so I don't know how accurate that is, but it is kind of easy to believe. But yeah, so we pretty much ditch the supernatural in a way. There's a couple of things in there that kind of maybe hint at a possibility of something potentially supernatural, but for the most part, it's horror brought on by like just circumstance. Like I said, just all the pieces falling together in all the wrong ways to make this happen for these people. Um, and as it begins, we get an introduction to, like we were talking about with Rachel and Zelda, where there's kind of the symbolic fear there before what's really the thing that you really have to fear sets in. And in this particular case, it is Tad thinking that there is a monster in his closet. And we get this scene at the very beginning when he has to turn his light off and get back into bed, and it's like his bedroom suddenly becomes the size of like a fucking just an enormous place. And it reminds me of like the beginning of It when Georgie's in the basement. Where it's like it has nothing to do with anything else, but it just sets in that sort of irrational fear, which I think works really well in setting up Tad's character, and exactly how it's really, once that is ingrained, we're in a much more sort of fearful place when Cujo is coming after them, and he is under the impression that Cujo is that monster in his closet that has escaped. It kind of brings on this nice whole other layer to just it's a dog attacking them. Like it comes from such a deep fear inside Tad already. Is a great way to build stuff like that up. And then we get this opening scene where it's like we were saying, it's really just circumstance. Like this whole horrific endeavor comes from Cujo just being a dog and just running around the yard and exploring, digging in holes, and then just one little event sets everything off. And we sort of see like the decomposition of everything as we watch Cujo in these certain scenarios, and he's just kind of getting seemingly more and more worn down. It's much more helpful in the book when we see things from like his perspective, uh, and we kind of hear like the way everything becomes amplified around him and like drives him to insanity. As the rabies really sets in. And I like the way they play this up in the movie, where it's like, it seems like when after the rabies is starting to set in, it's like every time Cujo is around in the movie, the sound like amplifies a little bit. And you can kind of get a sense of the discomfort inside him as it goes more and more towards the ultimate turning point, which I would say the turning point in the movie would be Another great use of fog to show the sinister and the impending fear is Brett outside looking for Cujo, and when he comes out of the fog, and we see that he's changing very rapidly, which just happens to coincide with the two of them leaving, and leaving him with Edlar, who is going somewhere else also. So there's this whole thing of it's the fear inside Brett of is Cujo okay or not, but that's something that's a lot more in the book. We almost abandon Brett and his mother like entirely by the end of this. They're actually left hanging like period. But there was a whole other thing there also to where it's like it kind of adds this once again a tragic sort of thing to it. That there are like we see this monster and that there are people, particularly a child, that loves this dog as his pet, and that he becomes this. So there was potentially missed opportunity there to kind of add a bit more of an emotional layer to the horror also, but once again, you're making an hour and a half horror movie, and I guess sacrifices have to be made. But talking about all this stuff, that does question the pacing. Given that the entire first half of the movie is not them being attacked by Cujo. So, I actually think it's especially, like, if you've read the book, the entire first half of this movie happens in, like, the blink of an eye. Because it seems like there's so much going on, and it's like an audience watching this that doesn't know the story might think it's taking a very long time to get to a certain point. But it's like, it just happens so quickly when you know all the stuff that goes into it. But I think even if you don't necessarily know the story, there is enough going on that gets you to that point. Because there's so much stuff going on between, like, the relationship between the Cambers and how we kind of sense the reason Charity wants to get away from him and get Brett away from him. It's just in these little interactions. The whole lottery win thing. And then there's the whole thing with Steve Kemp and she's cheating on her husband and all that. And then dealing with Tad's fears. And then setting up what Joe's going to be doing with his buddy and how they're going to go off and all this stuff. There's a lot to kind of set up for how they get to this point. I would say the main problem that the movie has is, in regards to maybe moving a bit too quickly, is that there's not really enough time to anticipate. Like, when you read the book and you can see all this stuff happening, like, oh, the car keeps breaking down, and oh, Joe's going to be going away, the other Cambers are going to be going away, and it's like, from a way distance, you can see the pieces starting to come together, and it gives you this anticipation of, it's one of those cases where when you can put together and know exactly what's going to happen, it's actually an asset, because there's that anticipation of, you can sense the danger getting closer and closer as these events just fall right into place, sticking these two characters with Cujo in the middle of nowhere with nowhere else to go. But yeah, there may not be like enough anticipation in the movie, where it's like as soon as they get out into the Cambers, it's just happening suddenly. It kind of all happens kind of quickly, but in as far as the attack scenes go, it does seem like something that might be a bit redundant. I remember, much like Pet Sematary, this was a movie that I didn't necessarily like the first time I saw it, and it was before I'd read the book. It may seem a bit redundant, just the whole idea of it. But the way they do handle some of these scenes, and the way they do some of the camera stuff, that's the revolving scene in the car is really well done. But also the start of it, being what I think is probably one of the better jump scares in horror movies. And that's when Cujo first appears to them. Because it takes something that you kind of expect, but just takes it a little bit, like just enough farther, that it still really catches you off guard. And that is the way the camera lingers and the way the framing is. We're totally expecting the reveal of Cujo to the two of them to be, he appears in the window. But the way they do this is they could have just had him, like multiple scenes in the movie itself, just him come up to the window and start barking, and that's the reveal that he's, fucked up now. He's like full on rabies now. But they take this a slight step further, where the window is down a little bit. So he does, the first time they see him, the first moment they see him, it's not just him in the window barking. It's him jumping halfway into the car. Like, just the very first moment. Where it's like, he doesn't gradually get there. It's just one moment, there's nothing there. The next minute, he's halfway in the fucking car. And I always thought that was a really effective way to just immediately set all that off. And then the way it goes on, as he like stalks them around, where like sometimes you can never quite tell, because he's pacing around so much. We're not always quite sure where he is, especially from their perspective. So like he could be hanging out in the barn, he could be laying on the porch, or he could be somewhere in the car's vicinity, but we can't see him because he's so close. But then there's that moment that they don't necessarily use as a jump scare the way they did him in the window, was when she kind of looks over and his face is just there, just staring at her through the window. And it's like the way this sort of takes in, the way Cujo sort of personifies so many different fears. There's the whole thing about being watched, like seeing a face in a window is in that scene. There's the thing about, the whole thing about Tad seeing him as the monster that was in the closet this whole time. And then there's the whole thing of the harmless becoming the harmful. And it's like there's so many different facets to why Cujo is a terrifying monster, that I think really takes this, seemingly bare bones idea and really stretches it to the fullest that it can. And also in those moments, that are out of Cujo's control, kind of, when it's, the car starts, and she starts to drive away, and you kind of get that feel, it's like, oh, well, okay, problem solved, crisis averted. And she even gets, like, her final line in, when she, like, is pulling out, and then she stops to say her little, fuck you, dog line. And it's like, it feels like an ending. As abrupt as it is, it feels like an ending. And then the car just stops again. And then that's when it feels like, it's like, if they had just been stranded, and I'm sure people have had, like, the relatable instances in their in various ways in their lives to relate to this, where it's like they had. It's one thing, like, if they had just been sitting there and the car wouldn't start and the car wouldn't start, and there's a helplessness to that. But then it's like a whole other thing when they do have it, where the car does start and they think they've got it. Like, escape is right there in front of them, and then the car stops. And the fact that it was there for just a second and then it's not makes it feel even more helpless and even farther away as an option that they can just drive off. Even more so than if the car had never started again. And that when that sets in, I think there's just even more, that hopelessness just really takes over. And then it's also, there are some cases where the book might have much more of an advantage than the movie, because obviously when audiences watch horror movies, the first thing they want to do is point out how stupid the characters on screen are, and why they make the decisions that they do. And it's like a lot of the second portion of the book, in regards to her perspective, is her internal debates of when she's going to make a move and when she isn't, and why that is. And so you just kind of get a better vibe of that once you've read the book and then you see it. But some audiences may still be able to get that in regards to thinking about how you are in that position, rather than, like, this is one of those particular movies where it's like you really think about the options. When it might seem obvious to do this one thing, there may be 20 reasons to not do that thing. So yeah, even if it seems something so simple, like I said, just the circumstances surrounding how this all built up is just really kind of spectacular that he was able to pull this off, especially if he was in a state to where he doesn't even remember writing this. And that's pretty much sets that up. There are some things here that are... Most of my problems with the movie kind of fall in line with ones I have with the book also. And that mainly is, and maybe there's something I'm misunderstanding here. Maybe there's a piece of the puzzle I'm not quite getting. Regardless of how many times I've visited the story, but the whole Steve Kemp thing is like a lot of build-up for not a lot. Because it does seem like, and maybe some people see it as a strength that they didn't take the obvious route, but I still feel like whether reading the book or watching the movie, the whole character of Steve Kemp feels like build up to making a character that we hate so much, that is such an absolute irredeemable piece of shit, that we're gonna get that payoff moment when he's ripped apart by Cujo. It's like it gets us to the point that we want that, honestly. And his character is more or less a dead end. Like, I mean, you could say it works for the character development between the two of them and their marriage and all that. It could be showing, like, because you see how anything can become a monster even if it's innocent, like Cujo. And it's like even somebody that's human can have like a monster in them, and so we get the moment where it like tears the house up. In the book, he goes as far as to jerk off onto their bed. He's a really fucked up character that just kind of gets abandoned here, and really his only purpose ends up being to, I guess, send them on a goose chase that's keeping them away from checking the cameras or anywhere else. So they get stuck on following him around, and it keeps them more trapped. I suppose that's the extent of his purpose. But it's like I believe there's even a moment in the book when he learns where they are, because she left a note in the kitchen or something, and it perfectly sets up that he's going to end up out there and potentially one of Cujo's victims, and it's just a dead end. It just doesn't go anywhere. So like I said, maybe I'm missing something there, or maybe that's all it was intended to be. I don't know, but like I said, there's still some of those things in there where maybe it's just sort of setting up the terror in itself. Like another instance in the book that they took out of the movie was, which I'm kind of surprised since they decided to focus so much on the serial subplot, that we didn't get the scene in the book when we only hear about it on the news, but it's when the mother takes the little girl into the bathroom and she starts puking the red, and it's like all over her mouth, and it's like it almost seems like that's sort of foreshadowing of just like the sort of, I don't know, like the rabbit case or whatever, but yeah, but really in this it's just they just blatantly make it the setup. Like it's not really to set up a particular tone, it's just to give the husband a reason to leave. So there's that. And as far as the liberties, like we were talking about which one's a more faithful adaptation, and it's like obviously it'd be Pet Sematary because he adapted it himself, but also just because it is. Whereas Cujo takes a lot of liberties in the final act that really are different from the book. Most notably, the death of Tad. And that could be something where the movie could be criticized and you say, like, oh, you wanted to make a mainstream movie, so you're not going to kill the kid or whatever. It would be later that would get the movie where they actually kill the kid, but twice. But the thing here is that I do think once again, I was talking about Pet Sematary, if you look at it from them having to make a horror movie, to where you don't have a lot of the context that the book gives, like you have no choice but to sort of whittle it down and still make a tellable story out of it. If this movie had played out exactly as it does, and then Tad died at the end, that would be such a jarringly, like the shift in tone to an ending like that in a movie like this would feel so kind of out of nowhere, that in the context of the movie, I really don't think it would work. And I think they probably saw that pretty early on, especially since there's the whole because if you were going to kill Tad in this movie, you would have to have what the book has, which is that whole epilogue where they grieve him. And it's like there's only so much where it would feel like because you already had to take enough out of the movie, because it's not as out of place in the book because the book has so much time to go into the other human characters, whether it be Camber's friend or the Camber family themselves, and all the scenes with Charity and Brett at her sister's house. Even the moment where the husband's business partner's having like an emotional breakdown because he's afraid that this deal is going to fall through and his wife's going to leave him and all that stuff. And it's like there's a lot more sort of dealing with the human side in the book that it sort of makes sense that we eventually go. There's not too much of a transition into the whole one major character dies and then they have to grieve and then Brett learns what happened to his dad and all that, and it's like I said, they just leave the cameras pretty much out of it once they leave, and then Joe's dead. So there would have been the movie would have felt like it took a sudden strange direction if it kept the ending of the book, I think. And so to stick to making a monster movie, to have the scene when she thinks she's killed Cujo and he comes back one more time and she shoots him and then they come back together for the happy shot as the credits roll. It may seem like a cop-out, but I mean, tonally, as far as adaptation goes, it fits the movie a lot better, I think. Where the book's ending works for the book, and this ending works for this. And you can say, I mean, honestly, I would buy the argument if somebody wanted to say the ending barely fits the book. But, but like I said, it does have a lot more, it does go into a lot more, like, into that whole emotional side, as you can suspect, as most books do. Like I was talking about how King has so many more layers to him than just horror, and that's all it is. There's always some sort of multiple layers to where that fear comes from and the human side of that. But I do think as far as an adaptation goes, it would be weird to say. It would be, like, I don't know if I can bring myself to say that this script was a better adaptation of King than King adapting himself for Pet Sematary. I don't know. I honestly feel like there's less problems for me in Cujo than there are in Pet Sematary, and how Pet Sematary has those moments where it can't decide if it wants to do the tragic thing or wants to do the campy thing, whereas Cujo seems to find a line that it doesn't stray away from. It's like, I think this, like, even if we have to take liberties, even if we have to change the ending, this is the path we're gonna go on, and it's pretty straight. We're not diverging too much. We know what we want, and this is the movie that it's going to be. And I don't quite get that with Pet Sematary. I get some indecisiveness there as far as tone goes, but still, a lot of the scenes are very effective, and there are more. I'd say there's more, genuinely terrifying scenes in Pet Sematary than there are in Cujo. So Pet Sematary works better in that regard. But like I said, as far as staying on one path and knowing and making one consistent movie, I think I may possibly prefer Cujo by a little bit. So that's a really tough thing to say, but but I think that's the way it is. So I think that's going to be it for this one. The next two, I think we only have 3 left already. We're going to do Argento, we're going to go into a couple of classics, and then we're going to end on a series. So that on top of reviews and stuff, and then this will be followed by a couple of videos that me and my brother did, so, and then that should finish out October once we get to the next Oscar video. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.